Welcome to the ChickenBytes podcast series, in which we unpack the issues currently facing the South African poultry industry. In today's episode, Chris Hattingh from the Centre for Risk Analysis returns to provide an update on developments since our previous discussion regarding the impact of Trump policies on bilateral trade with South Africa. Welcome back, Chris, and thank you for joining us once again. Since our last conversation, what key developments under the Trump administration threaten South Africa's bilateral trade relations, particularly in the context of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA?
Thanks very much, Jenny. Always great to get to talk with you guys. So the Trump administration has come out of the gate swinging with lots of initial movement around various trade agreements that the US has with many countries, as well as the global trading system. So we've seen lots of executive orders signed by President Trump. Some of his colleagues in the administration, such as Secretary of State Marco Rubio, has put out statements about their concerns about South Africa. So while that's not purely legislative, it does send a sort of sentiment signal coming from the new US administration. So just on the executive orders, I think there's one especially to highlight, and that is one that was signed on the 13th of February, entitled Reciprocal Trade and Tariffs. And this undertakes a wide-ranging review and has proposed to change how the US administers tariffs, as well as how the US administration views global trade and bodies such as the World Trade Organization. So they want to undertake a comprehensive scope examining non-reciprocal trade relationships with all United States trading partners. Now, part of that executive order includes examining, and I quote, unfair, discriminatory, or extraterritorial taxes imposed by our trading partners on US businesses, workers, and consumers, including a value-added tax. End quote. And they also want to look at things like non-tariff barriers, any unfair or harmful acts, policies, or practices, including subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very wide-ranging. I'm not saying they're going to be able to do it overnight. There are different timelines for this sort of thing. For the investigations that need to happen, you need the United States Trade Representative, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, of Commerce, and a few others. This now falls under their purview to conduct this sort of investigation and examination. Now, if we look at what South Africa does with our domestic trade policy, where we have, in terms of just our basic trade infrastructure, things like ports and railways, which don't function, which inhibit trade. But also if you look at things like burdensome regulatory processes, if you look at some of the localization master plans that in many ways propose support for South African businesses, those forms of subsidies, these things are possibly now under investigation. That doesn't mean they're going to be found to be negative, but they are under investigation, and it just places even more of a spotlight on South Africa's trade policy space. And as you mentioned, South Africa, of course, forms part of AGOA. AGOA is up for renewal in September this year. So I think this broad review by the United States could then be used when they assess whether they proceed with something like AGOA, and if they do, what changes need to be made, and then if those changes are more harsh, as it were, which countries continue to form part of AGOA or not.
What are the latest economic implications for South Africa if it were to be excluded from AGOA? How would this impact key sectors, and what measures can be taken to mitigate these effects?
The industries that would be most impacted would be agriculture and automotive. So if you look at agriculture, that includes things, for example, like wine, citrus, some areas of the poultry market and poultry sectors as well. Those companies, especially that export quite a lot to the US. So if South Africa is excluded from AGOA going forward, that doesn't mean that South African exports will no longer have access to US markets, but they won't enjoy tariff-free access. So whatever tariffs are then imposed would be in effect, or which are already in place, would essentially be affected on imports from South Africa. which then could raise the costs of those imports. And then in turn, the producers of those products or those components, if it's an automotive, for example, they either then need to factor that into their business operations or possibly pass that down to consumers, which results in higher costs for US consumers, especially. In the South African context, that might mean scaling back some investments or operations where costs need to be dealt with. We could look at things like job layoffs, probably not wide scale, but it would impact business profitability and operations, I think, on a day-to-day level. I don't think it would be the end for any of the particular players in any of these sectors, because they do have exports to other markets, and it is perhaps a harsh and good signal that they need to develop, where possible, other export markets now, in case something like AGOA doesn't proceed. So I'm not saying that other markets could replace that value that exporters get from an agreement like AGOA, but it's better to plan for it and to try and mitigate it somewhat than to be caught off guard if now it is not renewed. So I think in many ways, the US still views AGOA as a useful trading tool and a useful tool for US influence and US Africa business relationships. But I do think if it is renewed, it's going to be with stricter conditions, and those could possibly be even more strictly enforced by this administration. So whether South Africa would then qualify for that becomes an uncertainty. South Africa at this point in time is not viewed that favorably in the current US administration. So either one deals with that and you pivot and you deal with the reality, or you continue to operate as is, and then should things change for the negative, then your business suffers.
Do you anticipate government engaging in diplomatic efforts to secure its AGOA membership?
Yes, 100%. I think that's already underway as we speak here at the end of February. President Ramaphosa has indicated, and his spokesperson have indicated, that various envoys and delegations will be sent to Washington. But before they go to Washington, they will also go to different capitals and countries around the world. So China, Germany, etc. South Africa's relationship with the European Union has really been highlighted in the last 2 to 3 weeks. The European Union has talked about South Africa as a, quote, reliable and predictable partner, which is an interesting signal for them to be sending from an EU perspective. So the South African government, I think, will undertake either direct or more indirect routes and engagements in Washington to try and influence things where possible. The president has indicated, President Ramaphosa, that South Africa wants to explain its sort of views and positions in Washington. I don't know if Washington is unsure about South Africa's foreign policy positions. I don't know if that's the issue. I think the issue for Washington is more that they strongly disagree and how that impasse is dealt with, if it can be dealt with. But I think from the South African government's point of view, they will be trying to send engagement wherever possible. And of course, they can use the G20, which is currently underway. The finance ministers are meeting this week and next week in Cape Town. So here again at the end of February, you had a few meetings earlier in January, and this will run throughout the year up until the main summit, which is held in Johannesburg. So South Africa can also use the G20 platform. And if possible, if President Trump then decides to attend the G20 summit in November, that would be a signal that some of that behind the scenes diplomatic work has been successful. I should also mention I will be taking a trip to Washington in March to go and meet with policymakers and lawmakers and business. So I'm hoping I can also come back with some more useful insights in terms of just what the temperature is in Washington at the moment.
Looking ahead, what are the potential scenarios for South Africa-US trade relations? How can South Africa position itself to navigate the evolving geopolitical landscape and ensure sustainable trade and economic growth?
So I think a good case study to look at is India, the countries of India and Indonesia, and how they have dealt with a more a higher volatility geopolitical environment, where they've successfully talked about being neutral and non-aligned on various issues, but then built very strong trading relationships with countries like the US and China and a few others. For South Africa, I think the easiest of low-hanging fruit is to be clear on what our relationship is, and if it is negative, to shift away, at least in terms of rhetoric, from countries like Russia and Iran. I don't think the US has an inherent problem with South Africa's relationship with China, given China's economic importance in the world. I mean, China is very important for the US in terms of exports, raw materials, all that sort of thing. So the South Africa-China relationship is an important one, and I think it should be maintained and strengthened where possible, especially in terms of trade. But the relationships with Russia, number one, and with Iran, number two, and especially the regime in Iran, I think that causes a lot of concern in Washington itself. And then if you look at South Africa's taking of Israel to the International Court of Justice, there could be scope there if South Africa wants to lower the temperature and lower some of the focus from Washington to maybe not drop the case, but at least, talk about it in different kind of contexts or different terms. So there are elements here and there that South Africa could do from its side. And then also just engaging with the Trump administration on a win-win basis. So not going as a supplicant, not trying to go and explain ourselves, but going with plans about what investment we want to unlock in South Africa, what opportunities there are for American companies and the American government to invest, what we want to do in terms of reforms to labor legislation, to making it easy to do business. There's lots of things that South Africa can show, and steps and timelines that it's pursuing, especially from the government of national unity, that it wants to be open to investment from the US and from Europe. So there are elements, I think, that are within South Africa's purview. It's not like these choices aren't within our control to be making. And I think it's important to keep an eye on that. There is a risk that we lose a bit of sight in that we have now the presidency of the G20, and we talk about things like global solidarity and progress and these sorts of sentiment words. That sort of thing, it can work in certain contexts, but it's not going to work in the current geopolitical climate with the US and the signals that it is sending, even to its allies, to countries in Europe, to Canada, to Mexico. The US, I think, in terms of its foreign policy, is entering a much more transactional period. And you've got to engage on those terms if you want the benefits from that, and the US continues to be the economic powerhouse of the globe. So South Africa needs that investment. We saw recently the postponement of our budget speech, which indicated the fiscal pressures that government finds itself under. So if we want the investment, the job creation from as many sources as possible, including the US, we need to make South Africa as attractive a place for investment as possible. That means, reforms really need to be sped up, get our ports in order, get the railways in order, and really be open for business.
Considering the current unfavorable sentiment from the US administration, what are your thoughts on why South Africa appears to have neglected the security of its relationship with the US?
I think a lot of it is for historical reasons and sort of emotion and sentiment. So given that the ANC was the governing party for 30 years, the majority party in South Africa, when it was in exile, the countries that supported the ANC were countries like Russia, like Cuba, different countries in the Middle East. There was just a much closer relationship, and so there are historical reasons for that. There's also ideological. So I mentioned things like solidarity, the global South. When one is in that frame of mind, then you prefer to work with countries that are seen as oppressed by quote unquote colonial or imperial powers, like the US has been seen, like countries in Europe have been seen, and then one almost ignores the human rights violations or abuses that are implemented by those countries with whom one ostensibly has these historical ties. So I think it's partly historical, partly emotional, and then also for South Africa, given the domestic decline of our economy, for many South Africans, their quality of life has declined over the last 10 years or so. Between 2013 and 2023, we averaged only 0.8% GDP growth per year. When that's your domestic context, then you as a government, if you can find an avenue where you can still retain some of your moral influence, your moral weight on the global stage, as is the case with some foreign policy issues, then you're going to use that. It elevates your sense of self. It's a way for you to exert influence where you might have lost that in your domestic context, where you aren't able to do what you were able to do before. So it gives you a sense also of achievement and just, I think, worth in terms of your work. So I think those are the main things at play here. But as I say, we're entering really a period now where the nice words, the vibes, the feelings, the sentiments, that's not necessarily going to cut it in this current geopolitical climate. I do think we're moving into a multipolar era versus where it was unipolar with the US dominating all spheres. And in that sort of environment, if you don't get your domestic house in order, if your economy isn't growing, if you don't have reliable electricity supply, water supply, handle on crime and safety, then you expose yourself more to more volatile trade and geopolitical headwinds. So when things are more volatile globally, those countries that don't have their house in order domestically are more unstable, face more headwinds, find it more difficult to deal with. So this is the era that I think we're entering. It's up to us whether we take that signal and speed up some of these reforms to ensure that we can weather those changing times better than others.
Thank you for joining us today on Chicken Bites, and we hope to have you on the next episode.